thank you very much. We're delighted to be with you, and welcome back for those of you who have worked with us before. And for those of you who are new, we look forward to sharing ideas with you and best practices. Our focus today is on, you could go back, please. Thanks. Our focus is on how to unpack standards, but not just take them apart, to learn how to really bundle them and lay them out in the year, not just so we know when we're teaching and working with them, with our learners, but to personalize them, to truly engage our students. We think what we're going to share with you is fresh. It may be a little different from some of your work with standards before. Thanks. Next slide. So we have some learning targets. Preview of coming attractions, everybody. Remember this, because a big focus that we'll have in our work will be the creation of learning targets. And so here are yours and ours. I will examine how to align and bundle standards to support learners. I will explore how to unpack standards into learning targets. I can describe and explain the basics of learning targets, and I can describe the 3 sources for learning targets. One quick point. I think one thing Marie and I feel very strongly about is that when we have the opportunity to work with the group, we will do all that we can so that you leave with more than you came with. We will really give you our best, and we're so glad to be with you. Continue on, please. So we have a couple essential questions here. Let's read them. The first one is overarching for everything we do. How can we prepare our learners for the future? That's really the bottom line, isn't it? We don't want to prepare them for 20 years ago, although a lot of curriculum is pretty dated. We want to prepare them for now and into the future. The second question is, how do we make meaningful curriculum decisions moving forward? And so how do we act purposely, especially when we have mapping tools like we'll be showing and sharing with Chalk? How is personalization supported by the design of learning targets? Now we're getting into some nitty-gritty of how do we lay out curriculum in a way that truly engages our students. And before we move on, we want to thank Chalk very much for inviting us to participate in this program.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank all of you for participating. So hello to you from Morris County, New Jersey. It's a pleasure to be here with the whole team. For today's session, we're going to organize it into 3 parts. We want to start off just with the power of standards. We're going to talk about how to approach working with and aligning to standards. And they're a key element, just like any external alignment, right, to the creating of foundational learning targets. Then we're going to move on to unpacking as a process, a protocol, right, for creating learning targets from standards. It's about precision, and we're going to really hold to that protocol, and we're going to talk a little bit about the brain science behind it. And then we're going to close up today with thinking about how you design learning targets from your curricular context, right? If we understand that standards are a minimum expectation, then we do have to have that conversation about where is our maximum expectation. So moving in on the first one, this is going to align to our learning target. I will examine how to align and bundle standards to support learners. One of the big things here that we focus on is that standards really aren't curriculum. And they're not something that you check off on a list, right? Oh, I taught that standard, done today, moving on, right? So then how do we approach it? We use kind of like an analogy to help us. And Heidi, I know you have taught at the graduate level, so have I, but whenever I work with teachers and work around curriculum, I find that the vocabulary, right? That we have very different understandings of words like curriculum and instruction. So we have this analogy we use, and we'd like to share it with you today. Real quickly, standards, right? I want you to think of those as the boots, right? So building codes exist as they're really there for safety, right? They say things like outlets are a foot and a half off the ground, outlets. And we have them there for safety. And that's all they're for. Curriculum, on the other hand, is really more about an identity, right? So I can have a plan, an intended curriculum. That's like a blueprint, right? With architects before, right? So they're very familiar with making blueprints. That's not actually a building, it's an intended building. An operational curriculum, that's the actual building that you and I might actually build in a given year with a given group of children in a given context. But Heidi, if you're building on granite and I'm building on sand, right, we're going to make decisions that will end up ultimately changing how that building is going to look. But when we're designing it, we say things like, who are you? Who am I? What's its purpose, right? Is this building a hospital? I have some ideas of what that might look like. Is this building a home? I have some ideas of what that might look like. Once you and I have had that conversation to design our building, we make sure it meets code. We make sure all the outlets are a foot and a half off the ground. So in the same way that you and I wouldn't go to an architect like Keenan and say, Keenan, I'd like you to build me a building that represents all the building codes. But Keenan would look at me and say, what do you want? A room full of outlets? I'm confused, right? You wouldn't say, oh, I'm going to write a curriculum, making it exemplify the standards, right? That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is you want clarity. You want clarity about answers to two questions. Where is consistency required for student success? All the outlets have to be a foot and a half off the ground. Well, what do those learning targets look like? Heidi and I are going to call those foundational. And where is flexibility required for student success? And that's going to start impacting that curriculum design and those curricular learning targets that we're going to talk about. So hopefully this analogy helps you out. We're not going to go through the whole piece, but really our purpose here is standards are not curriculum. Curriculums tend to go above standard. So lastly, last thought here on this is standards aren't limiters. Just because something isn't in the standards doesn't mean you can't teach it. It doesn't mean, oh, we don't do that anymore. It's not in the standards. All right. Standards are an agreed upon foundation. So go ahead, knock it out of the park. Let's keep going.
So let me pick up on something. We're going to ask you a question here in the poll. But I'm going to ask you to take the poll off if you would for 1 sec. I want to you're a little too fast there. Thanks, Shindini. I wanted to say one thing here. As you said so beautifully, Marie, standards aren't curriculum. They don't tell you what to teach, when to teach, how to assess. They're sort of a set of proficiency targets, looking for a place to live in your school year. Also, we don't really teach them. Students are supposed to demonstrate them. So having some mastery over them is important. And one of the things people look at is they go, there are so many standards. So what we look at is we're looking at the question of priorities that are set up because student populations are different. So somebody just popped up from Ohio. That's a big state. They have a lot of standards and they have a lot of different kind of kids in schools. So in one school, there might be certain priorities that are more important or more in the foreground than others. So as we begin to look at the curriculum and how these standards will inform our work, one important variable is to the extent a school has taken the time to really begin to say, these are our priorities. And so that's our question. Thank you now, if you'll post it. We'd like to hear your response to this. So to what extent has your school unpacked priority standards? Let me read through them. We have all priority standards have been unpacked in all subject levels. We have priority standards unpacked in some subject levels. Some teachers individually have unpacked standards in their subjects. We don't use priority standards. I'm not sure what is a priority standard. So if you could take a moment, we'll wait for your response. Thank you very much. Should we take a look? All right. Let's see what came up. Look at that. It's very interesting. 35% have priority standards unpacked in some, 8% in all. 28% teachers are doing it. And a number of you want to know what it is and you're not sure. So here's an interesting piece. Thank you. That's really helpful for us as we proceed forward. So you can take that down. One thing let's take a look at is why it matters and why we keep using this phrase bundling. If you don't unpack the standards and have some look at the way they are going to play out, then what you may end up doing with good intention is cherry picking. Marie likes this standard. I like this one. Keenan likes this one. And the way standards were built, aka like a building code, is they're meant to be scaffolded over time. They were not meant to be used randomly. It doesn't mean everybody does the same thing at the same time. It's saying that this standard's going to be the spine. It's a spine. It's saying that these are proficiencies that are extremely important, and if we don't address them at some point, there will be gaps. But here's where bundling is interesting, and we just love this bundle. I know it's cinnamon sticks, but it's just such a beautiful bundle. Think about each one as a standard. So just for the sake of discussion, Marie, I am going to pretend you're a social studies teacher. You ready? In a middle school. You good? Okay. And let's say you have 8th graders. And let's say that you are studying questions about world geography. And you have asked your students to create some kind of a documentary that shows the highlights of different geographical features across the globe and show where they're alike. In other words, mountain ranges in 3 or 4 places, or canyons, or plateaus, or tundra, whatever it is. And the students are to work on it. They are supposed to find the locations, bring up imagery, and put this together. How many standards do you think you bundled together to make this happen? Give me hazard a guess.
Oh, sure. Well, let's think it through. I certainly have those geometry standards, geography standards. I certainly have literacy standards. I can have classical literacy standards if the students are reading things and I'm asking them to write things, or maybe even speak or present, and listening if they're maybe watching a movie or listening to a podcast. But I'm also asking them to create some kind of presentation. So I've got those media literacy standards in there. I've got some digital literacy standards in there. Oh my gosh, I could easily put 12 standards connected into that one assessment.
That's right. So one way to look at the bundle is it's not, here's a standard, find a continent, check. Here's, read a sentence, check. It isn't that. It's the demonstration that shows how they're often integrated. The other thing is we can also, though, dive into the standards in the fields they represent, because there's very important foundational skill sets we want to bring together. So the idea is, as you lay out your year, we need to figure out how to create this in a year-long context. Next slide, please. So what we'd like to advocate for is a 5-step process. We're going to walk through it. First part of that will be establishing the why. Why do a year-long plan and bundle the standards and put them in your map? Secondly, we'll look at examining the structure of the standards, their anatomy in a way, so that you know how to bundle them and put them together in any field. Could you go back, please? Thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. We then are going to look at examining vertically, because here's the thing that doesn't happen if the school district doesn't come together to set these priorities. You will miss your vertical build because you are literally creating gaps when people aren't aware of what the focus is, and they're doing their best, but it's kind of all over the place. We'll then look at organizing year-long contexts and then laying out the bundles with connections to themes and transfer goals. Thank you, Marie.
So let's start with the why. And the why has a lot of histories. You can look at the history of standards in your country or in your province or in your state. There's a lot of different reasons why we've reached out to creating standards. But regardless of the long-term history of it. For example, when I work in China, they have 5,000 years of history on it. And in other places, maybe it started a little closer to, the 1800s. But the 1990s was very important because the 1990s was considered globally the decade of the brain. We learned more about how the human brain learns in the 1990s than in any other 10 years put together historically. So all the standards that you and I are examining now, I would encourage you to look at the published date, because the standards that have gotten rewritten over the last 10 and 15 years have done so not because we just like changing everything and we want the new color fashion, right? It's because we're really thinking about what's a foundation for effective, efficient learning processes. And so you're going to see that literacy standards have been coming out now with sensitivity to the development of sound systems and the building and scaffolding, as Heidi was saying, this very intentional design, not going so quickly. We used to rush through things so fast. Give the brain time to develop. Another piece you might be looking at is the development of more listening standards, which we expect to see more in our literacy standards. You're seeing new digital literacy standards coming out. World language standards are going for rewrites. Music and the visual and performing arts. The idea here is you're seeing new drafts of these brain-based and content sensitive. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's less about coverage, right? It's less about coverage of all the knowledge and more about uncovering skills and also leaving room in the curriculum for the learners. So you're seeing a cutting back. It is a little bit of a less is more piece, and that's touching into the personalization that we're talking about. So not only do I want you to look at the history of the standards, but I also want you to look at your school and your organization's relationship with the standards. Why do you want standards at your organization? Are you looking to answer where is consistency required for student success? Children don't experience us as individuals when we're teachers, right? They experience us as a faculty. So getting into that conversation about where is consistency required for success can begin with standards. Let's look at the next piece.
I think a critical part of this is that just like there's different fields in the world, there's medical standards and legal and in business, architectural, and so forth. Within the subject areas, and the majority of standards still are very much oriented that way, and I think in the future you'll see a lot more of a shift towards something more transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary too. But each of the standard sets has a structure. We might use the word anatomy, and so they don't all look the same. And if you were looking, for example, at ELA standards, certainly you might see reading, writing, speaking, listening, although these are all codependent. In other words, you can't really read, you can't read until you can listen, and you speak based on listening, and writing is codependent, yet we go into those. You'll see them perhaps organized with headers that deal with informational or narrative types. That's in the area of English and language, and any other language would have its own earmarks and hallmarks. If you go to an area like science, for example, in the United States, we are very much involved, and have been for several years, with next generation science standards. Those are very different in the way they're structured and oriented. The anatomy year has both within some of the fields of science itself, but also cross-cutting types of standards, as well as procedural types of standards. So if you look at the subjects themselves, they are different, but the standard, the anatomy, the structure of the standard really helps, as well as understanding the codification and the language. These are not done just to have an organizer. They're done with pedagogy in mind. And so it's very important to understand the structure first. What sometimes happens is people just dive in and take a standard without looking at the structural bones that it's sitting on. So that's an important part of the process. Next slide, please. I think it's you, Marie.
Yep. So when we look at a structure of a set of standards, the way Heidi was talking about an anatomy, if the standards have been written post 1998 to 2005, you're going to have a why structure element and you're going to have a what structure element. What do I mean by that? That something in the statement, something in the structure is going to connect to a why. Why are we developing the brain to be a lens that can view the world this way? That why element would often align to essential questions if you're doing unit planning or transfer goals, but it would also be kind of something that we would look at in a preschool or early childhood all the way up to a high school or even a post high school experience, right? There's a range that they're articulating with a why. And then the granular or the what is really what you and I might call either grade level standards or even banded sections of standards that describe what the students should be able to know or be able to do by the end of that. So when you look at these vertically, you want to make sure that you've identified both of those elements. And then what you're doing is you're looking at the relationship between the levels. So for example, Heidi, you mentioned literacy earlier. If I were to use a set of standards like the Common Core standards or something like that, I think the kindergarten standard might say something like, with guidance and support, identify the main idea and a supporting detail. A first grade standard might say, identify a main idea and a supporting detail. So the only change there was with guidance and support. The second grade one might say, identify a main idea and several supporting details. Look at the nuanced shift. How would that impact assessment? How would that impact the diagnosis of a gap? The third grade one might say, identify the main idea and evaluate the best supporting detail. Now there's this level of evaluation. I'm looking at the verbs in the relationship between these. A fifth grade one might say, and for those of you singing along the words, yes, this is reading standard 1 for informational, but the grade 5 would be identify 2 main ideas in the text and several supporting details for each one. If teachers don't know where they fit in that relationship and they just go, oh, main idea and supporting details, I got it. And I'll just cover whatever's in my book and I'll do it my way. And every teacher does it their own way. That vertical relationship can get very confusing for the student. The teachers are going to be fine, but the student can get lost. And you can miss entire sections if we're not making commitments to one another about where we are going to absolutely overtly teach and get evidence of these standards as a vertical relationship. I think this one, okay. Yeah, okay. It looks a little different from what we had. So in thinking about that, the first step of what we do is we look at those standards and we then, especially if they're banded sets of standards, I would separate those into which grade levels or how you're grouping your students first. So what's a banded set of standards? How about the next gen, or you mentioned next gen already. How about the C3 standards? C3 standards are banded. When I say banded, what that means is they have a set of standards that have a relationship to a group of grades. So it might say by the end of second grade, meaning you have kindergarten, first and second grade to cover or divide up all these standards. And then the next set might be by the end of fifth grade, students will be able to do X, Y, and Z. That's what I mean when I say a set of banded standards. So the first step really for us to do is to divide those standards with a group. So let's pretend that Heidi and I are a team of teachers and we're working through a set of standards. We might do a close read of those standards within that band. And instead of saying, Heidi, you have to do all the standards in first grade, and I'll do them all again in second grade. All right, that's how we'll do it. What tends to happen when we do it that way is we both feel overwhelmed, right? We both end up trying to do everything all the time, and we start getting that feeling of coverage, like, oh, I got to get them all done every time. And what happens is we might rush through them to cover. And maybe the students could have used a little more time and gone a little deeper with a piece. So what we do is we take these standards and we divide them up between the grade levels with a close read. Look at the verb. If the verb says recognize something, maybe that would be done a little earlier. If it's really going into a deep analysis of the relationship of two things, maybe I'm going to need to do that, expect that to be fulfilled maybe a little later. Now, I want to be clear. This doesn't mean you don't do the standards. Remember, standards aren't limiters. You can do all of them if you can. But what we're making a decision about, what we're having a meaningful conversation about is what's the bare minimum? What is the guaranteed viable layer of what we are going to agree upon? That doesn't mean Heidi can't do more of those standards. She can do as many of them as she wants. Have them do the analysis. But when you have to make decisions about what to cut back or what to consolidate and what to create and what to keep, something we've all done over this past year quite significantly, then it's very helpful to have some kind of tool of agreement, a year-long context of the bundle of standards that I've made a commitment to overtly teaching and getting evidence of. So step here is split it up between the grade levels. The next step then is to take those and do another close read. Now, I will do mine individually and divide it up into time. So I split up my year into periods of time, not units, but periods of time, 6 to 8 weeks in general. And then I read each standard and I will do a divide and conquer, if you will, but I will divide them up between those periods of time in a way that's meaningful. Heidi gave us an example where she said, with one assessment, Marie, how many standards could you get evidence of? That's the lens you want to be reading these with so that you can have connected experiences and still get evidence of several standards at a time. That's what we mean by these bundles. Having a software can help you do this. And by having the way to organize it and maintain it, you can take a year-long context and kind of run it through curriculum units and experiences like a sieve. And now you have a connection to what's non-negotiable. Keenan, can you show us a little bit of what this might look like in a software?
Sure. So I'm just gonna grab the screen here. So what we're looking at here is one of the ways that you can actually kind of go through that bundling exercise based off of what Marie was just talking about. In this example, as she was saying with laying them out, not necessarily as units, but just as periods of time, what we've done here is we've actually kind of taken that infrastructure, what you can do within your maps, and just kind of labeled them that way. So here we're looking at the first 7 weeks from August through until October, November through December, January through February, and so forth. And you'll notice for each of these, we've actually been able to kind of bundle in those standards that we were talking about. And to actually do that, I'll just give you a quick example here. So if we're looking towards the tail end of the year and we wanted to add anything in here at the end, we can simply click in here, access the list of standards that we're currently working with. So in this case, we're looking at the Common Core State Standards from the state of California, and we can select from the list. So we can either search for keywords, or if we know what we're looking for, just scroll through and grab those, quickly add them. And then this is what we can use to kind of build those bundles out as we're working through that. And not only can we look at it from this lens, but if we want to kind of switch it up a little bit, we can take a look at the pacing from a calendar perspective. So here what we're looking at is we labeled those, and we can see that on the left-hand side here. And for each of those, just kind of get a glance on a calendar. So kind of factoring in things like Labor Day, the winter break, Thanksgiving. So we can really get a sense of better how those lay out, and even make adjustments on the fly here to really kind of play with how we want that plan to look before we start kind of diving in and fleshing those out and looking at it further. So that's just one of the ways that Chalk can help with that. And let's hand it back to you, Marie.
Sure. Thank you. A good thing to remember is that these bundles it really represents 50% of your instructional time or less, meaning you have a lot of time to do that curriculum, which is above standard that we were talking about, or additional standards, or fill gaps if they're there. All right, let's take this.
When I look at this is a pretty clear kind of think about it as a kind of a sketch pad here. Now you need to make sense of the time you have with your learners. And if we take that last image you showed us, Keenan, that had the sort of calendar layout, I think what might precede this would be to say, look, I've got my standards bundled, and I'm going to lay them across the year. And they could be very deliberately bundled between subjects. Elementary teachers tend to teach multiple subjects, and it's quite straightforward in doing it in that way. The POG could be portrait of a graduate or social emotional learning or any other standards you would like to bundle, and that's why that's noted. But the point here is some things logically should precede others. So as I'm laying out my year, I'm laying out where it makes sense, and in a few moments, we're going to ask you to think about something. These are the standards, but we started off by saying they're not the curriculum necessarily, are they? So it might be at the first of the year, you are a teacher who teaches freshmen, and you're a math teacher, and there is a sort of a reflection on sort of looking at what you worked on in 8th grade, maybe some pre-algebra stuff, maybe some other layouts. You're looking at thinking of geometry, some other ideas, but you'd start off the year. Well, clearly, if you're going to start off with geometry, then what you might do in that first unit is to look at that bundled set of standards that best matches there. Or let's say you're a world language teacher. Let's say you teach Portuguese. And what you're looking at is, this is my introduction and having the kids participate in my Portuguese class. The standards that bundle best, say you're using ACWL standards or world language standards, would be, these are the bundles that work best at the first of the year. And I'm coupling those also with social emotional learning. I want my kids to really connect. It's their first year of high school. So the idea here is you're looking at the learners, you're taking into account the layout of the curriculum, you're looking at where things mesh naturally. A bundle should be natural. It shouldn't be forced. A forced connection is a contradiction in terms. It's not connected. So we're looking to make this easier, not harder. Otherwise, what have you got? You have lists and lists and lists of standards, and you just feel like overwhelmed by them as opposed to making use of them. Thank you. Keenan, could you show us a little bit about laying out the bundles?
Oh, sorry. I think we just covered that. I think we're going to just jump straight into the chat.
Anything else you forgot?
I hope not.
All right, that's good. So that was fun. That was for your entertainment there. All right. So we'd like to ask you in the chat. We're going to take about 4 or 5 minutes here. Let's take about 3-4 minutes. I'm changing it. 4 minutes. That's what we'll do. We'd like to ask you to think about how having a year-long context might be valuable to your school, your district, both across the year and vertically. And give us some reasons why it might be helpful to kids, to you, for planning. And let's see a few of your reflections. Thank you. We'll take a minute or two, and we'll read through them.
Yep, we're opening up the chat here.
To all the attendees, please make sure that you put in reply to panelists and attendees so the rest of the attendees can also see your answers. Thank you.
Oh, these are good.
Yep. Wow.
These are great.
Yep.
I'm seeing common language a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's real important, and that it helps the culture of the school. I think that's true. Clear to the previous teacher. Great point.
It's that clarity, right, Heidi, about where is consistency required for student success, but also making sure that that's not 100% of my instructional time. And then allowing for where is flexibility required for student success, which you and I are going to talk about with that personalization and identity of a school. I think it's all, while people are participating here, it's important to note that standards weren't written by your organization or your community, which means it's not your identity yet. Curriculums have identity, right? Standards are safety and minimum. So we have to be clear about not only where is it going to help give us alignment, but also where we're going to leave some room for our identity and that of the students.
Thank you for that one. I really liked, I think it was Maureen wrote down, she thought it was a school's GPS. I thought that was really good. I think we should move on. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. So
Yep.
thank
Here
you.
we go. Okay, so order now and we will double your order. Not only does bundling standards help with alignment, both that vertical relationship and timing within a year, but it also makes an efficient sequencing tool. Yay! It could happen. So here's how it works. Sequencing matters. How we prelude to something, how we follow up with something in terms of the choices I make about which standards come first and then second and third matters to a student. And what we find is that if I do it robotically or industrially, meaning, hey, I should be able to take the same number of learning targets and the same complexity and just keep doing them over and over and over again all year long, and the students will just keep up. What we've learned now is that if I don't do that thoughtfully and intentionally, just follow the program with fidelity, we end up having students with brain fatigue at the end of the sequence. And we've come up, or I'll share it from my story, Heidi. I personally came up with all kinds of words for that. I called it senioritis. I called it spring fever. I called it post-holiday issues, because my students were taking longer to learn material that honestly, I really felt they should have been able to manage. And so what research has shown us is actually there's a reason why that happens. And we think about sequencing, if we don't allow periods of time to have the students develop a sense of expertise, right? I used to teach learning targets to the students, and as soon as they started to get proficient at it, and I had some repeated success, I would introduce a new challenge, which would then cause the need for new learning. And that's true. That's constructivism at its heart. However, if I keep doing that again and again and again with no rest, think about that to the brain. If there's no rest, then eventually the brain goes, oh, I think I got your number. You're just going to, as soon as I learn this, you're going to just hit me with another challenge. I think I'm just going to take longer to learn it. That's brain fatigue. So what we're learning now is when you're bundling, to take some time and think about your sequencing. And when you're sequencing, pace yourself. So if you see the top row, that's very similar to typical instruction. The way I originally did it, I would have 15 learning targets, and every 3 weeks, I wanted it to be 3 weeks. But eventually it started taking me 4 weeks, and then it took me 5 weeks, and then it took me 6 weeks. That's actually exponential. It gets longer and longer. But look at the bottom row here in this graphic. I can take 15 learning targets and take 4 weeks, even though I could have done it in 3. But for sequencing purposes, I'm going to intentionally take 4 to let the students develop a sense of expertise. In other words, get ready for the next challenge. Then I can do 2 sets of learning targets with 3 weeks each, no problem, moving on. But then I intentionally do another 4 week. Again, think of it as that rest to develop a sense of expertise. What research shows us is actually I can get to those additional 30 learning targets in 4 weeks less time. Let's see if this slide is going to work, Heidi. Is it going to? Nope, it didn't. So I just want to pause here. That first top row takes 24 weeks of instruction, whereas the bottom row, where you're sequencing with this rest, allows to teach the exact same number of learning targets in less time. In other words, we got 4 weeks of instructional time back through intentionally sequencing the learning targets in those bundles.
Okay.
Pause on that piece.
Section is on unpacking learning targets and standards. So first part in our brief amount of time with you is establishing the purpose of standards, how to make sense of them and lay them out. But here's where this is really interesting. Most schools that I'm aware of, up until maybe the last 4 or 5 years, went straight from standards. Sometimes they did a good job of melding them with curriculum. Some did not. but the shift has been moving to student-facing language. And so we're going to take a dive into this, because now we're going to begin to personalize it. It isn't that I teach the standard at you. You're the one. You're the learner. I'm the learner. I'm the one who has to develop my expertise and growth. So our learning targets, well, I will explore how to unpack standards into learning targets. I can describe and explain the basics. Thank you. Go to the next one. Oops. So a learning target is a clear statement of what a learner needs to know or be able to do from the student's point of view. It seems so simple, but it's fantastic what it does. These are statements of precise content written to be understood by the learner. Think about it. The standards aren't written for kids. They're written by state education departments or national organizations. And they have a reason for it. They aren't written for Maria or Abdul or Richard or Joey or Susie. Statements of precise skills written to be understood by whom? The learner. This is your education. And here's the clincher. It is really something. And as you listen and watch and observe, think about the power of what happens when we move the sentence, the actual linguistic syntactical structure, to I can or I will, and what shifts. Next slide.
So to build off of what Heidi's getting at here, the idea of teaching and learning, right? Have you ever tried to force someone to learn something? I mean, I want you to think about that for a second. Have you ever tried to physically force someone to learn something? It's an awkward experience for both of you if you think about it. And so we really, as teachers, have to understand that teaching is an invitational art. It's a science, but it's an invitational art. And so what you and I are doing is we're asking the student to accept that invitation. We're facilitating the learning environment. We're translating the learning targets. So the science of this and the art of it is that if I want to be effective and efficient as an educator, I am dependent on making those learning targets approachable and accessible to the learner. Heidi had it right. If it's not student facing, how are they going to accept the invitation? You and I could have written a curriculum, Heidi, that was gorgeous. I mean, something that would have made you weep for joy back in the 90s. And we could have had it laminated. But if that's teacher facing, meaning it's written for a bunch of educators, someone earlier was talking about edubabble, right? If it's written for educators, learners are at the mercy of us being in control of all that learning. And yet it is the learner who has to make the choice to improve their own performance. Heidi and I have found that that really is dependent on being approachable and accessible. And if you want more interest in this, Heidi, these they can go further research into this at the is that Learning Sets?
I'll put in the.
Okay, well, just in case anyone's interested in taking that further. But what's the brain science behind it? So I had someone say earlier, "Oh, Marie, this is an exercise in linguistics, right? You just put an I can or an I will in front of everything. Didn't we do that back in the early 2000s? I can statements for everyone." And I thought about that because there's I can understand why they said that, because sometimes it is as simple as I unpack the standard and word for word, it's exactly there in the learning target, and I put an I can in front of it. But see, that's really not all that's happening here, is it? Because those are just words. What it's about is the human brain. So when we command something, if I say, you have to do this, Heidi, okay, what happens is the brain makes a choice to understand what the command is, and then it makes a decision whether to do it or not from a fight or flight moment. What you and I are now talking about is if I say, I can do something, the brain now is making a choice about whether it feels doable or not. That is a completely different part of the brain. I'm nowhere near fight or flight, or what is known as the away state. Okay. So the away state is functioning on obedience. By the way, I'm not anti-obedience. I love obedience, classroom management. Here we come. But it's not the best for long-term memory creation. Meaning, if I teach children something in an obedience way, that information is now closer to the brainstem. And so next year's teacher, when Keenan says, "Hey, Billy, I heard you learned this." Billy goes, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And Keenan goes, "No, no, no, I know Marie taught it to you. Remember there was a picture of an ostrich?" And the child, Billy goes, "Oh, yeah, I remember." But let's figure out what happened there. If your students are doing that, that's a symptom that the information was learned in an obey state or the away state, meaning they can't transfer easily. They're not making connections easily. They need a breadcrumb trail. Keenan has to ask as a teacher the exact same way it had been taught. I want you to think about that for a second. Now, if I can get the brain to be in the toward state, see the ostrich leaning in, right? The toward state is going, is this doable? Can I do this? What can I do with this? And that I can signals as a cue to the brain to lean forward and go, is that doable? I think I can do that. What can I do with that? Or maybe even I can't do that yet. But all of that is in a better part of the brain up here in the cerebral cortex. It's better for long-term memory creation. It's better for the ability to transfer, and it's better for the ability to make connections. So let's look at this piece. We're going to see if this slide works. There it is. So now we're going to make learning targets. Yay, here it starts. Foundational learning targets. Heidi and I are going to say, hey, foundational learning targets are the non-negotiables. They can come from standards. They can come from, Heidi mentioned earlier, portrait of a graduate, outcome-based identifiers we use as a district. Maybe you have a mission statement. If you have a mission statement, we want you to look at that. You can create foundational learning targets from these kinds of commitments we're making as the foundation of our curriculum.
So let's take a look at this for a moment. Let's slow down and look at this visual. This is an example. So if I were looking at a foundational learning target, let's be clear. This is coming from something that is going to be most likely standards driven. I'm going to go into that standard. I'm going to open it up, unpack it, and look at related content. And the content is what we teach. It's the subject matter itself. So we go back and we look at the sample C3 framework standard, which is, of course, in social studies. It says identify positive and negative incentives that influence the decisions people make. Now I'm going to take a look at my curriculum here, and I'm looking at economics. I'm looking at incentives in economics decision making. Then I'm going to go a little further. I'm going to look at the skill. And again, it's precise. And where do we find it? What do we find in that skill? We find absolutely the standard again, embedded. And we see three of them. Let me just take the first one. Identify positive incentives that influence the decisions people make. I'm going to convert these and bring them all together now into a target. I can identify positive incentives that influence the decisions people make. It's doable. I can do this. I'm going to learn how to do this. And what's more, I can monitor how I do this. And eventually, we're going to produce evidence. Eventually, I'll show you what that looks like. So there's an elegance to this that actually leads to really, really good student engagement, where they are personally partnering with you in the design of their own learning. Thank you.
So we're going to run through one as a protocol so that you can recreate this on your own. And we encourage you to use these kinds of slides as a tool. But this is just a math standard. And you can see that the top part here this is from the Common Core Math Standards. It starts off with the actual standard, and then it seems to have an example here in italics down at the bottom. So step one is we want to really think about and highlight the verbs. What are the verbs that are going on inside this standard? So I see, well, there's going to be some sort of interpretation. There's going to be some solving. They're going to be needing to use a visual fraction model or an equation, and they need to represent the problem. So the first step, and sometimes we cheat here and we just hit enter in front of each verb, right? And then we process it. But we're really looking at, these are 4 different things that have to be overtly taught to the student. And we have to get evidence that have a way of being able to give feedback to the student on how well they're doing with that. So if I were working at a school and I was thinking about creating my unit plan or curriculum, I might start pulling out the nouns here as content. So I kept my A, division and multiplication of fractions. That actually came from the standard. That's very helpful if you're doing standards-based grading and reporting. That would be a good category. But notice this represents just nouns. It's the content. It are maybe the concepts that the student would need to either be able to define or recognize. But here are those verbs we're talking about. They have to describe a fraction as division of the numerator by the denominator. They have to solve word problems involving division of whole numbers that produce fractions or mixed numbers. And then they have to represent a solution using a visual fraction model or an equation. Now, this is teacher facing, meaning this is how my curriculum might be written. This might be how my unit plan for a skill would be written. So now I have to intentionally translate that into student facing. And so one way that might look is now I put that I can, because I want the first cue to the brain to be I can, and then that verb, an observable, measurable verb. So I can describe a fraction as division of the numerator by the denominator. All right, so I have to actually be able to say that. You want these to be approachable and accessible. If the vocabulary in here, now this was, I think the example here is for 5th grade. So I feel like 5th graders can understand these words, but if they couldn't, I would then want to make sure the vocabulary here was approachable and that the material and the connections that they could make would be appropriate. This is a good math example. We're trying to give you as many different content areas as possible. I think we have one more here.
Yeah, I think this is pretty straightforward.
Yep.
You can see how this works. You take the skill and you convert it into a learning target, and the student begins to own it.
Sure. The protocol we're using is right here. It's the I can or I will in front of a skill, as long as you already had an unpacked precise skill. Sometimes you might need to break down the skill further for a student to have accessibility. Sometimes, especially if you have a long list of learning targets, you might want to combine a couple to make it more approachable. Sorry. Heidi.
So let's share in the chat. What happens to the learner? What happens to you when suddenly it's an I can? What do you think actually happens to the learner at any age? Is there some kind of shift that you see? What do you think might be possible? Ooh, I like that. Agency and ownership. Ooh, look at you take off.
Wow, perfect. Yeah, I use it with graduate students now too. People think, oh, high school students wouldn't want it. They're still babies.
Look at these. These are marvelous. Oh, these are marvelous. Agency.
There it is. Maureen Ruby, student voice. Exactly.
They can imagine success. I love that, Wayne. That is super. Confidence. They become accountable. I love that.
Amy, exactly. Accountable for their own learning. And isn't that what we all want to say? It also increases self-motivation, keeping that super clear. Once I know, well, who was it? You know, if you keep moving the target, if I don't know what the target is, how can I reach it? Beautiful. Heidi, you ready?
I am. All right, let's go to the next slide. Actually, I think you're up.
Yep, here we go. So once we've created learning targets, foundational learning targets, one of the things you have to do as a teacher is almost code all of your materials, resources, lessons, and assessments to them. Okay, so you want to align these learning targets. They're the breadcrumb trail, if you will, the breadcrumb trail to all of the steps in the journey of your curriculum. And so that's alignment to the resources and assessment and evidence. Another thing we think about is the role of learning strategies. Learning strategies not to be confused with instructional strategies. Okay. So instructional strategies are the things you and I do as teachers to bring the learning to life in a classroom, right? We pull activities together and we do things to make it exciting and engaging. Fantastic. That's an instructional strategy. A learning strategy is something that a student or a learner would do independently. It's a way that they can practice the learning target or indeed even learn a learning target independently. So the teacher does not necessarily have to be there. Okay. So this is something that you and I could then align each learning target to learning strategies. I could even differentiate those learning strategies, which now allows parts of the curriculum to be individualized, meaning we hand over the learning targets and students can learn at their own pace in their own time. They control time. So individualizing some of our curriculum gives you and I more time when the teacher is there and we are there to answer questions and take things to a more rigorous level and personalizing it. So these are the steps you would take next with learning targets, aligning them to learning strategies and aligning them to your resources and your assessments. And when we say that, we mean actually putting it on it. This is an example of or let's say a screen, or think of those of you who use PowerPoints, you would put that learning target right at the top. Now, this one happens to be inside chalk. I don't know if Keenan wants to say anything about that, but my point here is that learning target is not something we just give lip service to. It is actually on my papers. It's on my notes. It's on my assessments, so that I am connecting my ownership of that learning to my evidence of that learning and my resources. By the way, just between you and I, students and their families are not that good at organizing their learning materials. Who's with me on this? And when the students were at home and we were doing distance learning, who sat there and went, oh my gosh, I just need to re-go over all these directions 100 times? Learning targets became a huge success with families, because if I have that on all my materials, I, as a parent, can support my student, my child, and I can see, oh, here's where my student needs to do it. Here are the resources to help my student do that. Learning targets, breadcrumb trails, live it, love it, learn it. I don't know if Keenan, you wanted to say anything about this piece here, or if we can move forward. Oh, wait, actually,
Goes
can
to
you show me what this looks like inside?
Yeah, let's take a quick look at this. So here's just like a quick example of how it can look on the week, but I'll jump over here. So just quickly starting from that same context we were looking at earlier, looking at the curriculum, and we're in this environment where we're able to actually build those foundational learning targets. So as Marie was kind of talking about there, aligning those directly with the standards here. Sorry, I lost my cursor. There we go. So here, for example, if we're working on, this is that math example we were looking at earlier, and we can go ahead and actually create those foundational learning targets directly within here. So these are actually created by you and your institution. So you can really customize these. This is pretty straightforward. You create a code for it. And the main reason for codifying these is it allows for some pretty detailed tracking to happen. So as a teacher, you can see where you're using those and how frequently. And as an institution, you can kind of reflect back on that as you're kind of looking for better ways to maybe improve how your curriculum is structured. So we'll go ahead and assign our learning target, our foundational learning target here to our map. And we're going to switch gears here a little bit. We're going to jump into the lesson planning side. So as Marie was just talking about there, about kind of like organizing your actual resources in the real context as a teacher. So with Chalk, our lesson planner is called a plan board. And from this perspective, we're going to be looking at an actual example. So specifically for today, for my students in our math class, when we're working through this content, how are we going to incorporate those foundational learning targets we were just talking about? So we can start by adding a title. So we're going to add a title to our lesson. We're going to come in here. We're going to start adding content, and we can type content. We can add hyperlinks, images, videos. There's a lot of cool things we can do from here, but really wanted to draw your attention to how we can connect it to that overarching unit we were just looking at. So we're going to jump into our unit content from our class here. And the first thing we're going to be prompted here with is those foundational learning targets. So we can pick from here, which one are we going to be focusing on as a teacher for today. I'm going to go ahead and select this third learning target, which I had just added. You might see it in the background. It's now already just added itself automatically to the top of the lesson. So it's right there at the front. And not only that, but we can actually go through the rest of our curriculum and look at the different resources that we have that may also be associated to that. So here is an example of maybe a learning activity. It's got a video in there. We can see it's correlated directly to that same learning target. And we can say, yep, we want to take advantage of this activity. We're going to go ahead and put that at the bottom of our lesson. And that's going to pull everything in for us. So we'll take a quick step back here. And we can see now, earlier it was just an empty canvas. Now we've got that learning target right at the top of our lesson. We've got those resources. If there's videos being embedded here, we can actually play those right from here, share that with the students directly, as well as any attached resources that go along with that, so that we can really kind of keep all those content organized, share it with our colleagues, share it with students, and have that organized for ourselves for now and into the future. So just wanted to show you some of those pieces, and we'll jump right back into the presentation. Hand it back to you, Marie.
Thank you, Keenan.
I think our next learning target is for you to think about how you can describe the sources for them. We've already looked at foundational. Now we're going to take a look at learning targets from a contextual point of view. Curriculum, models, samples, case studies, the actual work you're involved in. Remember, people, the standards aren't curriculum. Again, they're not telling you what to teach, how to teach, what your kids should read, what's going on out in the world. The standards were written before your students even walked in the classroom. Now they're there. And there's a world out there to study, as well as a lot of the good material you use. We want to keep things current and vibrant. Next slide, please.
Wow. Okay. So I apologize here. The idea of the curriculum context is that it's above the standards, or it's the richness and identity of either the school, the community, or the teacher who is designing this experience, this curricular experience. It might be visible as maybe the scope and sequence. Think of how you lay out your units and the titles that you use on your units. The books you might be reading, or might be case studies, documentaries that you're sharing and watching. The idea of some of the simulations you might be having your students participate in, or themes that you pick. The standards didn't give us all that, right? Those are all came from either the community, the teacher, or a team of teachers designing a curriculum. Those, though, will have additional learning targets. So here's an example of one. Let's take a quick look at this slide. Just like the slide we saw before where we had the C3 standard that was unpacked, okay? We want you to imagine that you already have your foundational learning targets, but now let's say here we are working on coordinate geometry, right? That was my foundational, but what was my case study I wanted to pick to take it deeper? Steering the Mars rover. Great. Now, there isn't as much research available right now on the current Mars rover, but I went a little deeper, and the one that went up in 2017, tons of material. So I would want my students to summarize that mission, describe what we learned about solar energy and impact, and then generate questions for the new rover team that's up there, right? So I'm giving them a context, a case study of what we have, and I'm connecting it forward. I unpacked that into content and skills, just like you see here. So I have 4 skills. They have to identify the mission goals for opportunity. They have to describe how solar energy worked for the rover and what conclusions apply to Earth. Summarize led me to these learning targets. That was me picking this idea of a Mars rover and then generating connections that made sense with the standards. I wanted my students to actually steer the Mars rover using coordinate geometry. So just looking at the top one, notice at the end, I can identify the mission goals for opportunity. That's my student-facing learning target. Any case study or example or simulation you come up with for your curriculum could go through this similar kind of unpacking process.
So I believe, Keenan, you were going
I
to.
think this is Keenan. Keenan, can you show us how to connect to that inside?
So I apologize. I don't have anything prepped for this. I already kind of went through that in the previous
okay.
slide. Sorry about that.
Well, I think this kind of shows it perfectly though, doesn't it? Because we're looking at the planner, the plan board here, aren't we?
Yeah. So this is like the week view. We were looking at the day earlier. This is kind of taking a step back and looking at it a larger context. The exact same thing as here. Yeah.
Got it.
Here's one thing I would observe here, and that is, as a teacher, there's a big difference between having confidence as a teacher, that the way your students are spending time is really purposeful, that it's being scaffolded, that you're working in partnership with other teachers. Because the opposite is, I can fill this thing up and keep them busy, but I'm not necessarily on target for mastery and learning. That's what changes. A school that moves in this direction has more confidence about what it's doing. And if there are problems, you can begin to address them more effectively. Next slide.
It's more efficient.
So
right? Teachers constantly complain about not having enough time, don't they?
They do. I think that if we press the magic button, I think
Here it is. I know.
So this last piece is particularly relevant as we finish up our time with you, because you can see that when we go to learning targets, we are immediately personalizing even the most required types of material. The student needs to make it part of who they are, their person. But then there's the opportunity for student-generated, student-facing, student-initiated inquiries, topics that are relevant and authentic to the learner. Next slide.
So now we're talking about student-generated learning targets, or even co-created learning targets. But there's a couple of pathways we find we take with students when we open up this door. The first one is the student might actually take the context you created. So let's take the Mars rover, but they might go further, deeper with that material. So maybe the student starts to want to reach out to Mark Rober, who designed one of the Mars rovers, and co-creates a YouTube video for his YouTube channel, right? That element wasn't part of my curriculum design, but the student now wrote learning targets that took it deeper. But in other ways, students might choose to go in a completely different direction. They might pick a whole new context. They might have hated everything about the Mars rover, right? But now they want to look at coordinate geometry and EMT, call and response, radio work. I may not know anything about that as the teacher. So now I get the opportunity to model adult learning. The student is going to write learning targets, and we're going to organize that learning, and we're going to go in that direction. And I'm going to learn right there with it. And I don't even have a whole network to support it. So the student is going to build that. And lastly, students can choose to generate a counterexample. So notice in my Mars rover example, I mentioned solar energy, and I was talking about its application to Earth. Student might sit there and go, no, I don't agree with that at all. And might take learning targets and come up with a counter story, an additional story, or counter evidence. Again, now we're opening up that dialogue, and they're taking ownership of their learning. So thinking about that, we wanted to take a quick moment, Heidi, here.
Yeah, that's fine.
We still have time? Okay, good.
No, I think we're okay. What we want you to do, we thought this might be fun. We'll do it too. How's that? Everybody do it. We're going to ask you to post in the chat an I can statement for yourself. State it as a personal learning target you'd like to work on moving forward. Something you'd like to be able to do more effectively. I can, or I will. And let's see what comes up. Let's see what happens if we give it a try. All right? Thank you. These are great.
Oh, beautiful.
I'm writing some. God, I'm on a roll. Hilarious. Really funny.
I just want to learn how to make it. I need to contact those students.
I was gonna say you're gonna have to get your hands on that recipe at some point.
I'm doing it. All right. Next session, I'm going to have the recipe. There
Yeah.
we go.
Did you put in one? I put in a couple.
I did. I put one in.
Find yours. Well, whatever.
Laura is supportive. Ishmael's like, yeah, kale cookies. All right. Are we ready?
Yeah.
I love it.
Let's go. That was fun. And you get the spirit. Marie, you're up.
Okay, here we go. So let's take a close look here. I know there's a lot of text on this slide. Please don't panic. All right, just hang in there with us. We're coming through, but we wanted you to have slides that you could take with you and model after as you went forward. So long story short, what you see here is Heidi and I took that idea of that NASA Mars rover piece we were exploring, and we said, what are possibilities? What are the possibilities that a student could then generate going forward? And we role played it out. So what you see here is our idea of a student working through that experience and then writing their own learning targets. So let's see what they did. Why do we spend so much money exploring? That was a student question. Well, how much did NASA spend on current Mars rover Perseverance? What incentives do we have to decide to go to Mars? Are there other places I would want to explore? Again, this is a brainstorming activity the student would be going through. What would be an energy solution I could support? So now the student had a lot of choices. Then they went a little deeper. So they looked at the cost of Mars exploration, places still unexplored, a little more information about the energy crisis, incentives to spend money on exploration. And then they started actually turning that into elements that could be learning pieces in curriculum. A teacher can help with this part. Well, you could list the places that are still unexplored. We could identify the cost of Mars exploration. We could explain the energy crisis or list the incentives to spend money on exploration. And then we could list the incentives to spend money on energy solutions. If that gets the student excited, they could then turn those into any of these kinds of learning targets. But the student, again, is, well, I can describe why we explore in unknown areas, or I can explain the energy crisis. Imagine a student being able to take ownership of that. I have an explanation for that. I can describe the incentives to support a specific energy crisis solution. That could turn into a campaign. That could turn into a lifetime of work for that learner if we open up those doors and keep it invitational. It's not, you have to do this as an assignment. It's an invitation to start organizing their own learning and making their own learning commitments. Now, the golden question we always have here is, so how do you organize that as a teacher? And this is an example of how we organize it. This is called a bird's eye view. This is just one example of that bundling of the standard learning targets we were talking about. What you see here are three kinds of learning targets and assessments. We tried to color code it. Hang in there with us. But what you see are foundational learning targets and exactly how many days I would need to support that instruction. You also see curricular context learning targets. Notice there's one on day one. Heidi and I would call that the launching, right? Hey kids, you're going to learn about the Mars rover. But first you're going to have to learn about coordinate geometry. Notice you see we return to that contextual learning target throughout the unit in the learning experience. Notice at the end, student learning targets start to come up. A very important point, notice that the assessments aren't just all at the end. These assessments are peppered throughout the experience, providing feedback to the learner so that they can continue to inform their process. This leads to a lot of things like self-navigation. This leads to co-created curriculum, but the start could be called the story of a learning target. And so today we just wanted to introduce to you the 3 different kinds: foundational, curricular contextual, and student generated. Heidi, anything you want to add there? I feel like we've covered a whole story.
We did. We've done a lot here. I think we can move forward. And
Hey, let's hear from the group.
so, Keenan, do you want to start us? How do you want to facilitate this?
Shinji, I don't know if you wanted to call it. There's a couple of the questions here. I don't know if you had picked one out as you were going through.
I find that the questions are all very specific to each individual situation. So maybe we can get a little situational here. So one of them is from Aurora. She's asked, we have a new standard list. How do we address the process to adjust our actual maps to this list?
Want me to go for that one, Heidi?
You should start. I have a few thoughts on it.
Yeah, I would say go through the process, right? You have a new standards list. So right off the bat, the things I would want to know is, okay, what's the anatomy of the standards? I would do a close read of them. Standards are usually like puzzles, right? There's puzzle pieces. They have intentionality. There's a reason why they look the way they do. I don't like making my units or my curriculum maps obey standards, and I don't like making the standards obey my curriculum maps, right? So what I try to do is understand the integrity of both. So I would kind of leave my actual maps out of it right now and just read the standards, kind of get to know them, bundle them, see how they go together, and then make a year-long context with them, maybe the way, if nothing else were happening, just those standards. And then I would crosswalk those 2 pieces with my maps, and I might have to make some decisions and tweak things here and there, but at least now both things have their own integrity. Heidi, thoughts?
The one thing I think there's very good sense in what you just said. I think one thing I'd be looking at is when standards have shifted or changed, very often it's because they've improved, because they were better than the predecessor. So I'm hoping the Common Core, which was written over 10 years ago, improves. It needs it. It really does. So I think in a way, the idea is to look at what has shifted that's better, that's stronger. Next Gen was a really huge shift because it was totally organized differently, but it's more sophisticated. It's more future forward oriented. And it adds more. So I think it's reading it to see what was the motivation behind it. And yes, most definitely, if they're better, they should inform your decision making. But you're going to need to own the process. I think crosswalking makes a lot of sense. And on occasion, you may need to do some overhaul. Let's face it. And maybe we need it. But most of the time, I think you're going to be able to do a pretty good job of making a transition and taking a determined look at what it is that has been featured here. Generally speaking, I will stick with that the standards need updating too. Think of medical standards. You want them to keep going through iterations and improve. Similarly, we'll look for that as well. Any other questions you want to get at?
Yeah, there's one more. I think the context behind this question is more grade level focused. So the question by Lila is, do we have to cover all the standards to move on to the next level or to the next grade level?
Well, gosh, that seems like a policy question. And it seems one of those, it's not about cover, right? So there's a lot of things in that question that I would want to have a conversation about. But there's a difference between covering the standards, right? That means the teacher covered it, and what the students actually retain and what they're able to get out of that. So the attained curriculum, right? We talk about intended curriculum, operational curriculum, and then the taught or learned curriculum. I would say before I made a commitment, I try to not have policies on things like that, because then you have to police them, right? And then you said, oh, well, that one standard they didn't get. And not all standards are created equal, right? So I think I would hesitate to make a policy like, you have to cover all standards to move on to the next. Really depends on the group of kids, depends on the background information of what's happened in terms of maybe environmental data around that area. I would hesitate to that. But let's look at the intent of the question. Back to Heidi's earlier point about cherry picking. I think it's okay to make a commitment that you're going to overtly teach and assess, meaning getting evidence of every single standard. I think that's okay. I can say something like that because there's only 32 literacy standards, or there's only 27 math standards on average per grade level. So it is doable, right? So yes, I'm going to teach them, but does that mean every child's going to be, by the way, I would avoid the word mastery because I teach graduate school. And let me tell you, even the whole I can write a complete sentence. Yeah, that's not even mastered at graduate school, right? So I'm not going to start talking about mastery or some kind of 80% of the standards. What I'm going to say is I'm going to give an opportunity to overtly teach it and assess it so that the students can move forward with a foundation. How's that?
Thank you. I have a question. Someone just posted, and I just missed their question, and I need you to write back. One of you wrote asking about physical education, and I was just about to write you, and then your question disappeared.
Oh,
Absolutely, go back in if you know who you are, because yes, this all definitely does. There are some great resources in physical education, and one group I'm going to tout is the New York City Board of Education. Has the most dynamite physical education and wellness program that they are instituting that's just revolutionary. It's amazing the way they've laid out standards. So if you will,
we'll put you in connection to those resources, and people are asking for samples. We can do that. Oh, Fleming has a great question here. Is newer always better? No. Good heavens. And also, just making something digital for the sake of making it digital does not impress us. But I think there's value in examining process and practice, and that it's okay to change going forward. And sometimes that means embracing the classical, right? That does shedding the new and innovative. Innovative has a high failure rate. But the idea here is to be balanced, and to be intentional, and to be thoughtful. And so thank you for your comment. As students being more confused than ever, Heidi and I feel honestly we have an oversaturated curriculum. We are looking really forward to reducing curriculum size by what, 50%, Heidi? Come on, join me in this campaign. That we are absolutely oversaturating the system. And you heard our jokes about brain fatigue, right? So no, we take this very seriously. Let's simplify and embrace classical. Socrates had a good thing going with inquiry, didn't he? Let's go with that.
Do we have time for one more question?
How we do? Yeah, how we doing on time?
Sure, yeah, I think there's one here from Cara. After a year of planning with COVID and working over the summer, my teachers are exhausted from teaching simultaneously in person and virtual students. I really want to dive in, but I want to respect their fragility. Is there a gentle way to push forward? What would be our first steps? Do we unpack? How do we do this?
Silver linings, right?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about what we did last time in the first session. Was we spent quite a bit of time on, Cara, I don't know if you were with us, on the response to the pandemic. And we talked about recover, refresh, and reset. And you kind of have to look at where your people are, but very directly, I am not into recover because that's going backwards. So I think the question here is to give people some breathing room and lower expectations. It kind of ties into what you were saying a minute ago, Marie, about cutting back. We should be trying to do less and do it better anyway. Coverage just doesn't work. It's drive-by. It is drive-by. It's high-speed driving on a strip mall where all the things look the same. Let's just get past all this fast food and just get to the finish line. That was a horrible metaphor, but
I was going to say, hey, that's New Jersey. Where are you going with that?
So I didn't say that. I don't know what you're saying. Of course. But at any rate, I think the point is that you ask a really good question, and it strikes me once we get the human factor, getting people and listening on the table. Our thoughts last time that we were talking about. You might want to take a look at that first session because I think we went into some pretty good detail on that, and certainly reach out and connect with us if you want more. But anyway, thank you. And thanks for attending. There's been some nice feedback here. And Keenan and Shinjini, it's just a pleasure. And Marie and I love working together, and having this chance to work with you is such a treat. And oh my gosh, the responses were fantastic. I want to definitely keep that chat. I loved all the things people posted this time. It was great. We're going to look forward to seeing you next time. Shinjini or Marie, maybe you want to comment first?
Well, I'm appreciative to Chalk for hosting us here today. Heidi, it's always a pleasure to work with you. Shinjini, Keenan, thank you so much for your expertise and your support.
Thank you both. Really excited to have you both coming on for our next week's session on how to design engaging instructional plans for our students with the students in mind. And I've already kind of gotten a peek. And I must say that I am mind blown. So you definitely do not want to be missing that session. Invite your colleagues, your administrators. It's going to be a fantastic session next week. Again, all the recordings and everything can be found on the post-pandemic website where you had registered specifically. So I will just quickly link that for everybody. Here you can find all the recordings, future, past as well. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email us at webinar@chalk.com or Dr. Jacobs or Dr. Alcock. I believe they'll be more than happy to help you all out. Also, you can tweet at us if you'd like, or share, on Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever your social media platforms